So the title of my talk is actually, once I wrote the talk, it ended up being sort of broader. I will talk about whether money can buy happiness, but I'd like to talk about some broader questions about happiness and capitalism. Actually, I feel like there's a bit of feedback. It feels a little loud. Can we turn it down just a little bit? Thanks. It's been really extraordinary being here for the last few days. Visitors to Singapore get such a warm welcome compared to what happens. Some of you have been to the United States, and you know it is a much less pleasant experience. You get the feeling that we don't really want you over there. We ask you a lot of questions. We don't trust you. We fear you. But here in Singapore, as soon as you arrive, you're offered candy. Welcome. Welcome. Have some candy. And then you deal with the passport person, and the next thing you're confronted with is, rate your experience. How was it? You know, in America, we really don't care what your experience is. But this is great because for the kind of thing I study, how do you get systems to work well? Having this kind of feedback loop, these evaluations are really, really important. And I was especially impressed. Then a few minutes later, so I go to the men's room, and I'm faced with then this question: please rate our toilet. And this is just wonderful. I think this really is one of the secrets of Singapore's success, is this extreme devotion to not just to giving you a good experience, but then also to having built into place data systems to then feedback. And I particularly appreciate the sensitivity. I mean, look at this, look down here. This screen is sanitized regularly. So of course, you know, who would want to push the button if you know that 100 other men have just pushed the button, some of them didn't wash their hands. So anyway, of course, those who didn't wash their hands then went to jail. No, never mind, that's, okay. So then we get out of the airport, we go to a hotel. The next day I take my kids to Sentosa Island, and the magic continues. We go to Sentosa, we see people just flying through the air. That was really fun. Then in the cable car ride on the way home, who joins us but Wonder Woman? My daughter was so thrilled. She loves Wonder Woman. So this is a special little thing they have. You download an app. But anyway, so it's really fun to come to Singapore. There's so many things that are so impressive about this country. Now, so today, as I said, I'll be talking about happiness and capitalism. And what I'd like to do is I'm going to sort of first talk at sort of like the macro level about countries, and then I'll zoom into the psychological level about what leads to happiness for individuals, and then we'll end with some considerations at the macro level and things that I hope will be provocative and start a conversation as Singaporeans think how to move forward or where you go from here. All right, let's begin. This is my favorite graph in the world. This is a graph of GDP per capita in constant 1990 dollars from the year 0, or the year 1 over here through this just goes through 2001. And what you see here is that for the first couple, for thousands of years of world history, everybody was living with basically sometimes, with just barely enough to eat and not much more than that. And then the Western Europeans develop mercantile capitalism. They start sending ships around the world, moving stuff around. They get more wealth. They're not making stuff, but they're moving stuff where it's more valuable. So Europe becomes much more wealthy. And then they develop, in England and Holland especially, they develop industrial in England and Holland, they develop corporate law, and they're able to create entities that can do big things, and they can make factories. They develop industrial capitalism. And it's actually the USA which masters the form in the 19th century. So the USA shoots up in prosperity before the First World War, and then what's especially amazing to me is that, look how rapidly the US and other countries go up to 1950, but look what's happened since 1950. I mean, the curve here is just unbelievable. What's also so amazing and wonderful is that here's the rest of the world, and this data set from this particular person who passed away a number of years ago stops there, but we all know that if you just pull these numbers out, India, China, Singapore are all up here. Actually, Singapore, as you know, is actually slightly higher than the US. So this is quite miraculous. This is what we've all been through as a planet. Not everybody's been through it yet, but most people on this planet are on this curve now, rising up very, very rapidly, which has massive dislocating, disorienting, mostly beneficial effects. But that's what we need to understand. How does this rapid change in prosperity across the globe affect our lives, affect our quest or our desire or our means of pursuing happiness? This is what we need to understand. It's completely transformative. Now, America, as I showed you in that graph, America was the first mass prosperity society. We created so much wealth, and in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, we actually had wage compression. We actually had shrinking inequality for a few decades. So our prosperity really was everybody going up. In fact, the working class actually made more progress, relatively speaking, than the wealthy did for a while. And so we had this mass prosperity. Middle class people could afford to buy these beautiful cars that had never been seen, obviously never been seen in the world before. And a lot was devoted to kitchens. Americans have always loved kitchens and bathrooms, and the kitchen of the future. This is these beautiful kitchens that any middle class, or even sometimes lower middle class to some extent, woman could have. That's the 50s. I love this one. This is the 1960s. So obviously the styles change, the culture changes. You can actually see women's norms about femininity changing in just 10 years. So things really, really change in the US and then in Western Europe as well. But as mass prosperity is increasing, as everybody's getting rich, not rich, I should not say that, as everybody's leaving poverty and becoming middle class, and the country's enjoying this gigantic boom of wealth, discontent begins to arise as well. The cult of rising wealth begins to be questioned. The most eloquent questioner, the most eloquent and beautiful statement of this new concern that arises in the 1960s in the United States comes from Robert F. Kennedy, the brother of John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, and Robert was assassinated just 3 months after giving this quote in 1968. But he said, "The gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile." So this discourse, this dialogue, this questioning, there's a general consensus that yes, we need to continue creating wealth and bringing people up, but that's not an end in itself. There's more. So this has been going on for a long time in the United States and Western Europe, and I'm sure it is happening, I know it's happening here in Singapore as well. In fact, what is the Singapore story? What is happening in Singapore? I gave a talk 2 days ago on the research that brought me here, research on capitalism and how it varies across cultures and the morality of that. And I remarked, I've just been amazed at how this country is so much less ideological than mine. Now, of course, that's largely because you have a one-party system, and there's not much room for certain kinds of political discourse and debate. But it seemed to me that, well, maybe there are at least some advantages of having no ideology, of having just a pragmatic government. But one of the faculty members who was in the audience said, well, actually, no, Singapore does have an ideology. It's GDP growth. GDP growth above all else. Everything in the service of GDP growth. And the numbers certainly bear that out, that ideology has been successful. I'm sure you've all seen versions of this graph. The blue line is Singapore's GDP per capita, which is really the key measure that one would want in constant dollars. And I've just graphed it. Google is so wonderful. I just typed into Google search bar GDP Singapore graph, and it helpfully instantly gave me this graph based on World Bank data, and it helpfully chose the USA and Hong Kong as comparators. And here you see it. So what you see is that if you go back to 1960, the US, the average GDP per capita was $4,000 or $5,000 of. Well, actually, I wonder whether that is adjusted in constant dollars, because that seems rather low in current dollars. But at any rate, the point is way, way less than it was, but several times that of Singapore. And as the decades go on, both go up, but the US is still way ahead of Singapore. Singapore kind of catches up in the late 1990s, but then kind of drops back. And so even as late as 2002, the US is still nearly twice, the GDP per capita is nearly twice that of Singapore. And just in the last 10 or 12 years, my God, look what this country has done. That is, people talk about the Chinese miracle, and of course China is a miracle for a large country to sustain that, but Singapore's growth has been astronomical the last 10 or 12 years. And I'm sure you're all quite proud that you've beaten Hong Kong by quite a lot there. GDP growth, if that's the ideology of the government, they've been very, very successful, and that suggests that you guys are newly facing all kinds of questions, as we are in the United States. And there are two reasons why this new wealth might not just be a good thing. There are two reasons why this might lead to a kind of questioning the sort that we have had in many Western countries. So here's one, which is that as Singapore is getting wealthier, inequality is rising. Now that is happening in every country, in just about every country that's getting wealthier. It's going up to some degree. But let's look at the numbers here. So Singapore, the blue dots are Singapore. So actually from the 60s through the 90s, Singapore got steadily wealthier, as you saw in the last graph, with barely any rise in inequality. It's really quite remarkable. And actually the last 10 or 12 years, there's been not much of a rise in inequality. But it's this period in the 90s in which inequality skyrockets. I don't know what policies were carried out in the 90s, but that seems to have greatly boosted the incomes of the wealthy. Now it's interesting, and so of course people who are on the political right will say, well, see, if you make the rich richer, the next decade, prosperity skyrockets. So I don't know what to make of this except to say that overall inequality in Singapore has risen. Now Singapore can be commended in that this country has grown its GDP faster than the US has, while actually having inequality growth that is less than the United States. So if you put those two metrics together, this country is more successful than the US in raising prosperity for all. I shouldn't say for all, but at least it's in widely shared prosperity, more successful than the US is. I just thought I'd put in here also Malaysia. I don't have the numbers for Malaysia's GDP growth, but Malaysia has not been experiencing a rise in inequality. And many Western European nations have been having very little as well. So it's not that every country has a rise, but most countries do. And that can lead to resentment. I forgot to mention, this shows the percent of income captured by the top 5%. So in Singapore, it went from about 22% to about 31% over that time span. So when you have a rise in inequality, that can breed resentment. And then, of course, as someone said to me, well, in the US, it's a big country. If you don't want to go to Beverly Hills or Wall Street, you don't have to. You can live in a town where there aren't billionaires. But in Singapore, you can't do that. Wherever you go, you've got billionaires, and you've got an advertising culture that is targeting people and saying you should try to live like these billionaires. You can't avoid them. Of course, you have more billionaires here per capita than any other country. So wealth is in everybody's face, and that is another reason why that could lead to some resentment, some questioning, some backlash. There's a second reason why things are likely to be changing here. And that comes from research on modernization. Many countries have gone through this process of going from poor to wealthy, and there's a lot of research on what happens, and it paints a fairly consistent portrait. Here's how it goes. The leading researchers are Ron Engelhardt, who runs the World Values Survey, which is this gigantic survey they do. It's now up to 100 countries. It started with about 60 countries. And what they find, every 7 or 8 years, they give a representative sample in each country, like about 80 or 100 questions about values, all kinds of values. And when they factor analyze, when you compute for each country, you compute the mean score in each value, and then you do a factor analysis or any other techniques, but for looking at relationships, how do you map out what countries are like what based on values? What they find is that there are two dimensions that really matter. You can capture most of the variance with these two dimensions. So the first is that there are traditional values, and as countries get wealthier, they become more secular and rational. So traditional values, valuing religion, family, country, order. You all recognize traditional values. So countries tend to move up as they get wealthier. And then there's also a movement from survival values, which is wanting to just get resources for your family because you don't know what's going to happen. The world is dangerous. You don't trust people. And as people get wealthier, they care less about that. They can take survival for granted. And they begin to care a lot more about being authentic, about expressing themselves, about expressing their ideas. They are more trusting. They are actually happier. So those are the two dimensions. And when you plot all the countries in the World Values Survey, this is what you get. Now, you can't read the individual countries, but what you get is the Islamic and the Sub-Saharan African countries are down in this quadrant with traditional values and survival values. The Scandinavian countries, the Protestant Europe countries are up in this quadrant. They're very secular, and they're focused on self-expression, not safety and security. They have very good welfare states. Life is very safe and secure in those countries. So that's one quadrant. That's another quadrant. And so Catholic Europe is here. The English-speaking countries tend to be a little more religious than the Scandinavian countries. So the USA is actually down here. Of course, it's very high in self-expression. USA, Canada, New Zealand, Britain, Australia, Switzerland, Denmark, Sweden, those are the highest on self-expression, but they vary on religiosity. Up here, you have, unfortunately, they didn't plot Singapore on this graph, but China is here, South Korea is here, Hong Kong is here. So presumably Singapore would be somewhere around here these days, although these countries are all moving. So that's the general lay of the land in terms of how countries resemble each other on values. Now, the interesting thing is the movement. And what you might have noticed is that if you look at these two corner quadrants, every country down here is poor, every country up here is rich, and you might think, okay, so as countries get richer, they move up and to the right. But what Engelhardt and his colleagues have found, or at least the way they interpret the data, I should say, is that there's actually a two-step process. So as countries get wealthy, well, the way every country gets wealthy just about is they move from agriculture or fishing or other very low-tech, low-efficiency sorts of things. They move almost always to industrialization. They work in factories or other things where you have to conform to the machine. It's not about self-expression. Your time becomes money, and when time is worth money, ritual is a waste of time. People get less religious. They focus a lot more on making money. So this is the first movement. When you get that transition, they go up. But then gradually these countries, and we're seeing it in the Asian countries, we certainly saw it with Taiwan and Korea and Japan previously, and now even China is moving away from factories and towards more service types jobs. Then when that happens, you get a movement from materialist values to post-materialist values. So the movement's like this and then like this, or at least sort of in a curve. And those are very different kinds of movement with very different effects. So the net effect is like this. And so what we can expect Singapore to be going through, and this is just a broad generalization, every country has its own unique path. It's not a guarantee that this will happen to Singapore, but these are the general trends that countries tend to go through, is that once life becomes very safe and secure and they begin that rightward movement, you get increasing emphasis on quality of life, on environmental protection, and on self-expression. Elsewhere they talk about you get increasing gender equality, gay rights. You get a whole package of things that we recognize in the West as sort of the progressive side of things. So things move, you might say, in a leftward direction socially, as it were. Well, if that's the case, what should Singapore do? This country is about as self-reflective and self-conscious and deliberate in planning as any country I've ever heard of. It seems to be an economist's paradise. Economists have been let roam free in the government. But interestingly to me, it seems that it's not just economists. That is, they do have a few social scientists other than economists. And so I think in coming years, Singapore is going to want to pay a lot more attention to positive psychology. So let me tell you a little bit about positive psychology and share some findings with you. Positive psychology is a kind of a branch or a movement within psychology that started in 1998 when a man named Martin Seligman, who's one of the leading clinical psychologists, he did research on learned helplessness. If you raise your hand if you've ever taken a psychology class here. So, okay, about a quarter of you or less. So psychology is the greatest field in the entire academy. You should all take psychology. Seligman was elected as president of the American Psychological Association, and each president just serves for 1 year, and they tend to have one initiative. Usually it's like, preventing child abuse or drug abuse or depression or suicide. And Seligman, people advised him about all the things that he could do, and he said, wait, everything here is negative. Everybody focuses on the negative. Isn't anybody looking at the positive side of life? Do we have anything to say about the positive side of life? Most people aren't mentally ill. Most people are doing pretty well. So his metaphor was, if you want to go from -8 to 0 in terms of how your life is going, yeah, we got you covered. But most people are above 0. If you want to go from 0 to +8, who do you turn to? You have to go to the bookstore and buy some schlocky Deepak Chopra or some sort of popular thing that's not based on research. And there should be research. So he started this field called positive psychology to look at that. We have a science of mental illness, but we don't have a science of mental health. Well, boy, did things move fast. There's been a huge amount of research. We've learned a lot. I was one of the he put a call out for people who were studying things related. I was studying positive moral emotions. So I was part of the first wave of young psychologists, I was young back then, young psychologists who moved in and began talking together and working together to study all these positive psychological elements. And we decided early on that the field should focus on 3 different areas: the study of positive subjective experience, positive traits, and positive institutions. Today I'll just talk about the positive subjective experience, but I think Singapore in particular is really good at thinking about, I'm sorry, that's not showing. There it is. Really good at thinking about positive institutions. And so I'll mention that again at the end. Now, so let's talk about happiness and positive experiences. As Professor DeMeyer mentioned, my first book was called The Happiness Hypothesis, and it grew out of the fact that I was assigned to teach introductory psychology at the University of Virginia. And while I was teaching, I would use quotations from the ancients to illustrate psychological principles. And I'd use Buddha and Jesus and Mohammed and Marcus Aurelius and Shakespeare. And so I thought, well, gosh, there's a lot of these, the ancients were really horrible at chemistry and biology. They had no clue about the natural sciences, but they were actually pretty good at psychology. And I wonder if we collect all these ancient sayings about the mind and about psychology, how did they do? And so I did that. I read lots and lots of classical works, pulled out all the psychological statements, grouped them together, and evaluated them. And I pretty well expected that they would do well, that the ideas that came down to us through the ages only come down because they kind of fit, they kind of worked. And so I expected them to do pretty well, but I thought it was going to be 10 separate chapters, disconnected. And it turns out that the 10 chapters were actually united. The theme, the thread that ran through most of the chapters was relatedness, the importance of relationships, the fact that we are incomplete as individuals and we are searching for completion through other people. So that was the theme that came out. So hold that in mind as we go on. Let me illustrate that a bit with the great truth number 2. So this is chapter 2 out of 10 chapters. So here are 3. Oh, God, this doesn't show the same as this. I guess we're not in monitor mode. I'll have to keep looking back. So there's nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. Do you guys recognize that? Who said that? Come on, you're former British subjects. You should know this. Okay, so that's Shakespeare. It's from Hamlet. Second, the whole universe is change, and life itself is but what you deem it. That's Marcus Aurelius. And the third, we are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts is Buddha. So you get this very important idea expressed across the millennia, across the continents. That's a great truth. Is it true? Well, yes, and there's a lot of psychological research explaining why. Now, I'll just give you this one case study which illustrates it. This is from the Hebrew Bible, from the book of Ecclesiastes, a man who introduces himself, he calls himself Koheleth, which means teacher, I believe. People used to think it was King Solomon. It could not have been. But it's a man who says that he was a king in Jerusalem. He says, I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and the provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and delights of the flesh and many concubines. So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. Now, he then goes on to say, well, that sounds pretty good, right? But he goes on to say, well, then I considered all that my hands had done and the toil I had spent in doing it, and again, all was vanity and a chasing after wind. So we recognize this. We recognize that one can be fabulously wealthy and successful, yet still feel empty, that material possessions, outward signs of success are not sufficient. They're not enough. In fact, I know nothing about this man, but if you were to discover that he's actually depressed and miserable, you wouldn't be amazed. I mean, I might say, wow, gosh, he's so successful. But you wouldn't be so surprised because you've heard stories like this. It's not surprising when people are not happy with their outward success. Now, how can that be? Well, this kind of situation suggests to us that what we'll call a happiness hypothesis number 1 is that, I'm sorry, let me just back up and say, when I was writing the book, I actually was going to title it originally 12 Great Truths, Insights into Mind and Heart from Ancient Cultures and Modern Psychology. And I got a contract, I started writing the book, I ran out of time, so I had to change the title, and I changed it to 10 Great Truths, Insights into Mind and Heart, so I cut 2 chapters. But it turns out that for trade books, the title is a marketing decision, and Basic Books made up the title, The Happiness Hypothesis. And I said to them, well, I don't know what that is. I mean, what if someone asks me, so Professor Haidt, what's the happiness hypothesis? What am I going to say? I don't know what it is. But by the time I finished writing the book and revising it, I realized actually it works pretty well. Because in the book, there are actually 3 different hypotheses about what causes happiness. Okay, and this is the first one. So the simplest hypothesis about what causes happiness is that it comes from getting what you want. We strive for things, we get them, we're happy, right? But most of you know that when you work hard for something and you get it, you feel more relief. You're happy maybe for an hour or a day, but it doesn't last. You're on to the next thing very, very quickly. And as we've seen, one can be extremely successful and unhappy. So I think we can reject this hypothesis, and let me explain the mechanism why outward success doesn't lead to a lasting happiness. So let's do a little thought experiment here. A lot of the research here is done with a simple question: how satisfied are you with your life these days as a whole? So think to yourself right now, how satisfied are you with your life on a scale of 1 to 7? And so I'm going to ask you to graph out your happiness. So pick one of these numbers, 1 through 7, are you a 4, a 5, a 6, whatever you are. Sort of mentally fix your gaze right at whatever spot you're at. And then I want you to think about how your overall life satisfaction will change over the next 5 years under 2 circumstances. In situation number 1, you win the lottery. Do you have a lottery here? Is that okay? Yeah, it's a good way to tax poor people, is a lottery. So you win a gigantic lottery, and you are going to be rich for the rest of your life. So just what would happen? Suppose you start at 5 or whatever you are. Would it go up? Would it go down? Where? What's the path? Imagine for yourself what the path would be and where you'd be in 5 years. Happier than you are now? Raise your hand if you think you'd be happier than you are now if you won the lottery. Okay. Now, suppose instead of winning the lottery, you fall down a staircase and you break your neck and you're paralyzed for life. And you will never walk again, you will never feed yourself again, you will never have sex again, you will be confined to a bed or a hospital for the rest of your life. So trace out for yourself what you think would happen. I assume you would go down. Raise your hand if you think that 5 years from now you would be less happy than you are today if you broke your neck tomorrow. Raise your hand. Would that affect your happiness? Everybody thinks so. In fact, what we think generally is that things would go like this. Most people, and I've done this with many classes of students, everybody guesses that if they win the lottery, they'd be happy, and if they break the neck, they'd be unhappy, and surely that is true. But here's the kicker. How would things change over time? This is what people think would happen, that 5 years from now, they'd be vastly happier if they won the lottery than if they were paralyzed for life. But in fact, what happens, not that anyone's done the exact experiment, nobody's actually gone in and interviewed people. So you broke your neck yesterday. On a scale of 1 to 7, how would you say you feel? But what we basically find is this. This is an interpolation, but this is the general pattern. So here's how to understand it. If you win the lottery, you're thrilled. You jump up and down. You've all seen, did you do that here? You only see happy, cheering people, and they're so happy and excited. But what would really happen to you if you won the lottery? Remember I said that the key thing to keep in mind is relatedness. What happens to your relationships when you win the lottery? Well, in America, everybody sues you because they think, they have a claim, they have something, for some reason they think they have a claim on it. Or people are nice to you, but they're only nice to you for your money. So it really damages your relationships. More psychological, well, that's psychological, but another mechanism is called adaptation. This is really the key that I want to get across. At first, suppose you're a middle-class person, at first, it's great fun to be able to shop at the expensive grocery store. And if you're really rich in Singapore, you could actually buy a car. So you could do all these things, and that's nice, but the human mind is extremely good at noticing changes. It's very bad at noticing absolute levels. So as you're going up, you feel good, but you adapt to it, you habituate to it. And what studies have found is that when people become wealthier, simple pleasures like drinking a glass of orange juice don't give as much pleasure anymore. Sitting and talking with a friend doesn't give as much pleasure anymore. There's so much more you can do, so much more you can be doing. So you sort of ratchet up your expectations about consumption, about activities, and then your life meets your expectations. But it met your expectations before at a lower absolute level. The point is you adapt on the way, you adapt to the new higher level, and your happiness returns basically to baseline. What happens actually is that most people, the great majority, return it fully to baseline. But there are some people that make decisions, and we'll talk about those later. There are some people that make decisions that actually do enhance their happiness. So some people can stay high, but the great majority return to their baseline. Same thing on the way down. When you wake up in the hospital, you discover what has happened to you, and odds are you would wish that they let you die, that they did not pull you from the wreckage of the car or whatever it was, and why did you save me? I wish I were dead. But what you discover is that with physical therapy, with physical training, after a few months maybe, you can actually have a little sip of orange juice. It's not just a nasal feeding tube anymore. And that first sip of orange juice is the greatest sensation you've ever felt, because you've sort of adapted to the horrors of your life, and every day or every week brings advances. You're making progress, and that progress takes years. And the other thing that happens, so you get the adaptation going both ways. The other thing that happens is what happens to your relationships. You will lose a few friends, but the ones that you keep get much stronger. You find out who your real friends are, and you now have nothing but time. You talk with people more. Even if you have to communicate with eye blinks or something, you still communicate more, and you have deeper relationships. So so in some ways they're mirror processes, but the point is that the big events of life, as big as winning the lottery or breaking your neck, don't actually make that much difference in the long run. It's astonishing, but that's the psychology of it. All right, let's go further. Just a little quote from Stephen Hawking. He was interviewed in the New York Times a number of years ago, asked, how do you keep your spirits up? And he said, my expectations were reduced to 0 when I was 21. Everything since then has been a bonus. So again, we reset our expectations, then everything is relative, and the rest of his life was quite an upward trajectory. So if it's not the big things, well, what about the little things? And this line of research here, this is what really launched positive psychology in the 1980s. Actually, work done by Ed Diener, is Christy here? Is Christy Skull? Oh, there it is. Her former advisor at the University of Illinois. So what was found was that these major demographic things that you'd think would matter don't matter. You know, you'd think the happiest people would be young people, because if you're over 60, and certainly if you're over 70, you probably have health problems. Because when you're young, you're almost protected, you're almost immune from health problems. And so you'd think that as people get older, they get sicker, they get closer to death, you'd think they'd get less happy, but actually the trends aren't that big, and the happiest people are in their 60s and into the 70s. What about gender? You'd think that men have more freedom, they can go more places, there are certain perks to being male in most societies, so you'd think men would be happier. But actually what happens is women experience more depression, that's true, but they also experience more happiness. Women are actually more socially connected, more tied, they get more pleasure from relationships. So women have more amplitude of happiness and unhappiness, but on average it's actually very similar. Race, at least in the United States, white people and Asians are much more successful. They, again, have many more perks than African Americans and Hispanics, but there too, there's not much difference. Wealth is where most of the research has been, and here the story is complicated and interesting. In poor countries, wealthier people are happier. If you really have to worry about where your food is coming from or how you'll feed your kids, then a few dollars extra a day make a big difference. In more advanced countries, the finding is, poor people, if they get wealthier, they do get happier. But the early research said that levels off around $70,000 a year of, I forget, $1990, something like that. But it levels off once you reach sort of middle class status. That's what we all thought 10 or 15 years ago. I'll say soon that the story, actually 5 years ago, the story has changed in the last few years, and I'll get to that at the end. But some interesting conundrums are that as countries get richer and richer, well, it used to be thought they don't get any happier, but again, new research is challenging that a bit. So the early research was that money doesn't matter nearly as much as you think, and it was really interesting because the people doing the research are academics, and then journalists are reporting on it. They don't make a lot of money. They loved the finding that once you reach their level of wealth, you don't get any happier if you get more money. So that's what everybody thought until just a few years ago. But it is clear that relative position matters. If you are in an organization and you rise up in that organization, we do notice relative difference. We do enjoy rising up. So those are the basic findings on, again, I've got to keep looking back because it doesn't, okay. Sorry about that. Okay, relative position matters, sorry. Okay, and so the reason, again, this is evidence for why these great truths are true. If that's the psychology of it, we're all about relative differences, not absolute, then it really matters more how you look at things. And the reason why we come back to this baseline, the reason why it's more in your head than it is your objective circumstances, is because we all have a biological set point. And this was, again, in the 80s, this discovery when we started doing twin studies and discovering that everything is heritable. So this is a standard normal distribution, you know from your statistics classes. The finding is that happiness, like most things, is distributed on a bell curve, and so about 16% of people are more than one standard deviation above. So people who are one or even two standard deviations above, there's not that many, but they're very, very happy people. They're happy throughout their lives. When bad things happen to them, they get unhappy for a few minutes or hours, and then they get happy again. They're just really, really happy people. And same thing over here. Those people here, we can say, won the cortical lottery. Their brains are set to approach. They see opportunities wherever they look. These people here, their brains are set to threat, withdrawal, avoid. They see problems wherever they look. They lost the cortical lottery. So the big discovery was that, first of all, everything is heritable, but actually average happiness is among the most heritable traits there is. So if you have an identical twin that you've never met because you were separated at birth, and I measure your average happiness level over a couple months, I can pretty well predict your twin's happiness level because it's very, very heritable. This blew people away. Even if you were raised in different social classes, different environments, very, very heritable. Okay, well, that's quite amazing. And I call it a lottery, like the cortical lottery, because happy people basically get all kinds of good stuff. They have more friends, they're more likely to get married and stay married, they live longer. When bad things happen, they grow from it. Yeah, it was terrible, but boy, I learned all these lessons, and I'm a stronger person now. It's important. How many people do we have here who are in business in some way, shape, or form? Raise your hand if you are a business person in any way, shape, or form. Okay, some. Raise your hand if you are a business student in some way, shape, or form. You're studying business. Okay, so happiness matters a lot in business, and it makes sense. Happy people are generally more successful. Their bosses like them more and promote them more. Their clients like them more. Happy people throw themselves more into projects than unhappy people. They live more fully in what can be called the realm of possibility. The only exception in which it seems as though maybe being a pessimist is advantage is being a lawyer. You don't want to go to your lawyer and have him say, "Oh, don't worry about it. Things tend to work out." So what this suggests is that this happiness hypothesis, number two, remember number one was we're happy when we get what we want. False. A much better hypothesis is happiness comes from within. That's what Buddha was saying all along. Good men at all times, surrender all attachments. Don't be attached to the external world. Give up attachments. Be indifferent to success and failure. You have the same thing in the West. The Stoics, Epictetus, do not seek to have events happen as you want them to, but instead want them to happen as they do happen, and your life will go well. So again, like withdraw from the world. Well, they don't say withdraw like don't be out there, but withdraw your emotions from the world. Don't be attached. Boy, that sounds so wise. And most of you are of Chinese descent here. This is Eastern wisdom. This is the wisdom that comes out of India and then goes to China and Japan. It sounds so wise. I used to believe it too. But I think we can reject this too. Not as firmly. This is a much better hypothesis, and there's some truth to it. But this, I think, is one of the great contributions of positive psychology, is that actually there are some things that you should strive for. It is good to strive. I mean, when my son is 8 and when he is 60 and 70, I would be happy if he achieved nirvana and ceased striving. But boy, I don't want him to stop striving now. He's only 8. It turns out there are a number of things that you should strive for if you want to be happy. And so this is not exactly a formula. It's really more just a heuristic. But the way to think about this is that your experienced happiness at any time is a function of 3 variables. S is your set point. That's the thing that your genes made your brain, and your brain is set one way or the other, on a continuum. So you have a set point, that's true, but you can actually change your set point. And that's what these drugs do. Lexapro, Prozac, all those drugs, they make you less threat sensitive, more willing to put yourself out there and have social relationships. So you can actually change your set point. But it's not your happiness is not just a function of your set point. There's variation around your set point based on conditions. Now I showed you that most conditions don't matter, but some do. The conditions that do are especially relatedness, to the degree to which you have good bonds to others, trustworthy, loving, friendly bonds with other people, that matters. And also control, a sense of control. If you have work where you don't have a sense of control, things happen to you, you can't prevent them, that's very stressful, that damages your happiness. And third, and this is I think the biggest discovery of recent years, is that there are some voluntary activities that work and others that don't. There are things you can choose to do as a practice, just as meditation, and meditation is one of them, but just as one could choose to meditate and do it every day, and that does make people happier, there are a number of other practices. And so right now I'm just going to tell you I'll tell you four things that you can choose to do, and you can start on them today, and it should make you happier. So the first is just diagnose yourself. This is the easiest one. Many of you already know whether you are sort of on the high end or the low end of that bell curve. But if you're not sure, you can go to AuthenticHappiness.org, that's Martin Seligman's research site, and you can take a whole bunch of surveys and find out where are you on this optimism, pessimism, and if you're on the upper half, great, go have fun. You can find some exercises that will help you get more pleasure out of food and things like that, but you don't have a lot of work to do. If you're on the bottom half, there's all sorts of things you can do to improve your mental hygiene, as it were, and you'll find some of those there. A really fun set of findings is related to your strengths. On this site, you can take what's called the Signature Strengths Test, and it'll tell you how you score which of these 24 strengths. Just as we have the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the Mental Disorders, that lists all the problems, we now have, this is sort of the positive version of it, 24 strengths and virtues. You find out which ones you're strongest on. And the key to happiness at work is try to recraft your job, change your job description so that you get to use those strengths on the job. Or if you can't do that, then you should probably change jobs. You'll be happier so don't try to fix your weaknesses. That's really hard. But if you get to use your strengths, your work will be much more joyous. So that's step one, is just diagnose yourself. Voluntary activity number two, if you do things that will improve your relatedness, those are likely to pay off. As I said, this is the unexpected theme of most chapters. And so if you do something that will improve relationships, that will pay off. Seligman invented this exercise that he did with his classes, and I've done it with mine. You assign your students to write a gratitude letter. We all feel grateful to some people in our lives. Maybe we think about it, but how often do you really say it? And so the rule is it can't be an email, can't be a phone call, it has to be in person. And so you write a letter, maybe a former teacher or a friend or a family, whatever it is, you write a letter and you make an appointment to go and you give it to the person and then you stay there and you talk about it. And that is, and people cry when they're telling their stories in class about their reunions with long lost friends and teachers. But it so improves relationships that it has a lasting effect. Also cultivating new relationships. And many people seem, relationships, well that means like love, that means like a romantic partner. Well yeah, that's important, but having friends and being part of a group, that in some ways is more important. It gives you often a lot more fun. So cultivating relationships in groups is extremely powerful. Things that you do that will put you out there, that will get you out of your it turns out even introverts who think they don't want relationships, if you assign them to do something social, they actually get happier. So think about that when you think about activities that you could do or choose to do. Now, a third voluntary activity, as I said, do things in groups. In a post-materialist society, as I showed you, countries, as they go through that curve, they get post-materialistic. Suddenly, people have a hunger for meaning. People in the bottom left quadrant don't think about whether life has a meaning or not. They tend to be very religious and embedded. But as people move to the upper right, they tend to feel they're more plagued by feelings of emptiness or pointlessness. It turns out that religious people are happiest. This is not necessarily true in Northern Europe, but in societies where there are religious people, where there are many religious people are happiest, so I presume that would be true in Singapore as it is in the USA. But research on religion shows that the key is not believing in God. It's not how often you pray. It's nothing about doctrine. It's the degree to which you are embedded in a community of people that are supportive and that maintain a moral order, that have a sense of we are doing good, we are helping each other be better. So join a noble community. It does not have to be religious. These are Amish people building a house together, very communal. It's a small religion in the United States. And these are in Médecins Sans Frontières. This is the French group that goes around the world with crises like the Ebola crisis. When you join a noble group, boy, is that intensely pleasurable. I don't mean it in a shallow way. It's intensely, I should say, meaningful. People remember these experiences for their lives. So that's a third kind of voluntary activity. And the fourth, and this is to come back to the title about buying happiness, there's a lot of new research on how to spend money. And newly relevant in Singapore. So suppose you had $10,000 that you could buy, that you could spend, and you were thinking either of, you finally got, was it an HBD, what are they called? HDB. You finally got yourself an HDB, and you're trying to decide, should I really spend a lot of money and get really good furniture because it'll last me for my life, or should I blow it all on a trip to New York? Or if you don't like New York, pick any place else. Now I would imagine, okay, first, what would your parents or grandparents advise you to do? Buy the furniture, I presume, because you'll have that for life. Whereas the vacation, that's over as soon as it's over. But which one do you think would actually give you more lasting happiness? It turns out that when you buy really nice furniture, it's a physical object, you tend to adapt to it, you get used to it. Again, we notice changes of state, not steady states. So people tend to adapt to material purchases, but experiential purchases, when you buy experience, especially if you do it with friends or with your family, when you share experience, that's really part of the key. When you share the experience, then it strengthens relationships. It gives you memories that can last a lifetime. People don't adapt nearly as much to shared experiences. It gives more lasting pleasure. Here's a really interesting study, Rosenzweig and Gilovich. When they asked people about the purchases that they regret, what do you regret in your shopping life? And so when they asked them about experiences, think about trips you've taken or other experiences, or the ones you thought of doing, what do you regret? And it turns out that people overwhelmingly regret the things they didn't do. So, I wish I had taken that year abroad. I wish I had gone on that day. I wish I had joined my friends when they were doing this, but I was too busy, whatever. So people mostly regret the things they didn't do when it's an experiential purchase. But if it's a material purchase, people mostly say, I shouldn't have bought that sofa. I shouldn't have bought that television. I shouldn't have bought this. They mostly regret the things that they bought, not the things they didn't buy. Very few of us say, if only I bought that diamond when I had a chance. They don't think that way. That's just not an issue. So when you think about it this way, and you realize that while social pressures and rationality push you to buy things, happiness research suggests you should spend more money or a larger share of your money on experiences. And think about this. Now look closely at this. Look closely. Yes, I'm sure. Actually, do you guys know who he is? I have no idea. Raise your hand if you know who this guy is. Okay, all right, so we can make up whatever we want about him. Tiara and Markham Shaw. His name is Markham Shaw, and his wife is named Tiara. Now, isn't a tiara like think of diamonds? Isn't that like you marry a woman whose name is lots of diamonds, and then you celebrate Christmas. And what do you put on your tree? What are all these things on the tree? It's all boxes from Tiffany's. And then you have this perfect little baby, and you give him some diamonds or something. I don't know what you're giving him. But the message here is buy, material things, expensive, upmarket, giant markup sorts of things. And this is really one of the downsides of capitalism, is that you have this gigantic industry that hires a lot of psychologists, all aiming their lasers, their focus, their tractor beams on women. luxury consumers. That's so much, it's aimed at men too, but it's mostly aimed at women to get them to buy material things, not experiences, material things. And this is really sad. And this is not a good way to make people happy. But that's what you see all around you. The better advice would come from reading this book by Elizabeth Dunn and Michael Norton called Happy Money. Liz Dunn was a graduate student at UVA when I was there. She's really just an incredible researcher. And so she and Mike Norton have done all these studies looking into how can you spend your money to actually get the most happiness from it. And the answer is by experiences, as I said, make it a treat. That is, don't do it too often. You habituate. So if you love ice cream, don't have it twice a day or even every day. Like space it out, you'll enjoy it more. Invest in others. It's not just the enjoyment of experiences; it's the shared enjoyment. That's what really pays dividends. So those are the four activities. Now I'm going to zoom back out to the sort of the national level. Now let's think about Singapore's situation. What might you do? Is there anybody here who is in any way involved in the civil service or the administration or government? Raise your hand if you are in any way involved in that. Okay, a number of you, okay. Well, I hope you'll be involved in the discussion afterwards. In fact, I'll direct the first question to some of you, just in terms of what does the Singapore government actually do to consult research in psychology? So let's return to this question of what can we expect, what is happening in Singapore? What can we expect to happen now that you've gone through this gigantic jump up in wealth? And now that your country is presumably moving somewhat in that direction, although it's not necessarily the case. And so what we find, as life gets very safe, we get an increasing emphasis on quality of life, environmental protection, self-expression. I just came across this very interesting research showing that while it's true that rich countries are happier, but they have a weaker sense of meaning in life. They're happier, but yet life is a little shallower. And so the finding is that as nations get richer, and this is a longitudinal study done over time with surveys in the same nations, what you find is that religiosity goes down and fertility goes down. And you're going through what's called the demographic transition. I hear Lee Kuan Yew once told Singaporeans, you're having too many babies, stop having so many babies, and now you've stopped having babies, and now there's not enough babies coming along, and that's going to sap your vitality in the future. So anyway, as you get rich, the opportunity cost of having a child grows, takes a lot of time and money. You could get a nicer apartment if you don't have so many kids. So you get these changes, and people get more educated and more individualistic. All of those things are correlated with a decline in a sense of meaning. They separately predict. And as nations get richer, their suicide rate goes up, and it's specifically the sense of meaninglessness that it predicts the rise of suicide. So there is a dark side to getting richer and actually happier. It's sort of happier in a shallower way. And so I just went out, actually, Christy, what was the name of the place we went to? Christy, what was the name of the town we went to, the area we went to yesterday? What is it? Ang Mo Kio. So we just went. I wanted to see I'm staying on Orchard Road, and I'm told that all of Singapore isn't like Orchard Road, and so we wanted to see some part that wasn't. And so now that Singaporeans have good housing, well, what's next? They might be asking. So you might be interested in consulting positive psychology, and especially thinking about institutions. I'll just briefly mention, and this will be the last part, this fantastic report came out. Those of you who work in the government, or those of you who are interested in public policy, just Google World Happiness Report. It's a really wonderful report. In psychology, we love to make fun of economists and say that they have no clue how people actually work. But these three economists actually really read the psychological literature. They did a great job with it, I think. And they review all this data that the Gallup company has collected across nations. And the key is this. Gallup used two different kinds of measures. There were emotion measures like, did you smile and laugh a lot yesterday? How much did you smile and laugh yesterday? How much did you experience sadness yesterday? How much did you experience anger? So you have emotion measures, and of course you want to see people experiencing more positive than negative emotions, especially as they get wealthier. And it turns out that that's the stuff that levels off. Once you reach middle class status, more and more money doesn't give you more positive emotions. So that's part of what the early findings were about how money doesn't buy happiness. Money doesn't buy additional happy feelings after you reach comfortable middle class. But when you distinguish those questions from what are called life satisfaction measures, these are more reflective, overall, what do you think of your life? And so the most commonly used question is called the Cantrell ladder. Imagine your life as a ladder where the best possible life for you is 10, the worst is 0. Where would you say your life is now? It turns out that as individuals get richer, their numbers go up, and as countries get richer, their numbers go up, and they keep going up. They don't level off. So actually, those conclusions that I was raised with, that after a certain point it doesn't buy happiness, it's not quite true. It's a more nuanced story. And I think there really is something to be said for people feeling as though their lives are close to the best possible life they could have for themselves. In other words, GDP growth is actually a good thing, but you can do better than GDP because GDP is such a crude measure. You can have much better metrics, and that's part of what they go into in this World Happiness Report. So I urge you to read that. The headline grabber is when they publish, they've done this twice now, they publish the rankings. What's the happiest country? Denmark. Then Norway, Switzerland, Netherlands, Sweden. So you'll notice that all the happiest countries, most of them are in Europe, most of them are small countries. In Europe, I put a little smiley face next to all the European countries. Those tend to be the happiest, but note that they're generally small countries. The US is 17, not remarkable, but still up there. Singapore, one of the highest GDPs per capita on the planet, but is not in the top 22. You have to go all the way to 30 to find Singapore. I believe Singapore has the highest GDP of any country on this page. In other words, Singapore is under-happy. Singapore is less happy than your wealth would expect, would predict that you be. So just something to know. It's not bad. It's not doing badly, but it's just off the trend line. It's not as happy. Now, in part, it might just be that that spectacular GDP growth, is going so fast you haven't sort of caught up. And so maybe in 5 or 10 years, maybe there's a lag. So you might catch up even if you don't do anything. But you have a real planning culture in your government, so you might be thinking about that. Another good thing about the report is they're able to do statistical analyses and regression analyses to figure out, when we look at this cross-country variation, what causes it, what predicts it? And their conclusion is that there are 6 factors. Simple per capita GDP, you take the log of it, that's predictor number 1, and that is the largest single predictor of the cross-national differences by country. Other things that matter, years of healthy life expectancy, having someone to count on, again, relatedness, perceptions of corruption, prevalence of generosity, and freedom to make life choices. Now, if you look at those 6, just what little I know about Singapore, it's doing fantastically well on 3 of them. I mean, this is really a remarkable country, especially on the corruption. I mean, Singapore's world famous for that, and bravo to you. It's such a hard thing to root out, but you guys have done it. So Singapore's doing very well on some of these, and I have no idea I could dig into the data and find what the numbers are on having someone to count on and prevalence of generosity. I don't know what those are for Singapore. Maybe you have a sense. But the last one is freedom to make life choices. And now, while you are free to make life choices in Singapore, it is, to someone who comes from the United States or other countries, issues of freedom are complicated here. And Singapore is ranked on a scale of 1 to 7. Singapore is ranked as only partly free. It's ranked as a 4 on a scale of 1 to 7, where 1 is totally free. That's most of the European countries and the US and Canada and Australia and all those countries. So Singapore is very low compared to its comparison countries on some measures of freedom. And that might be something to think about as, again, we go to post-material values and more desire for self-expression. So I just read this article yesterday. It came out in The Guardian a day or 2 ago. The price of life in Singapore, city of rules, it's a Faustian deal. And it looks that way. And when you compare it to many other countries that were poor 20 or 30 years ago, wow, it was a good deal. But at some point, it might be the case that Singaporeans will be questioning or renegotiating that deal. And that is my closing thought. So to conclude, I've told you that there are 3 happiness hypotheses. Happiness hypothesis number 1 was that happiness comes from outside, getting what you want. 2 is it comes from within. 3, the one that I endorse, is that happiness comes from between. It comes from getting the right kind of engagement between yourself and others, yourself and your work, and yourself and something larger than yourself, some sort of noble team, noble movement, religious movement, political movement, being part of something larger. If you get those conditions right as an individual, then just wait and purpose and, those are the 3. Just wait and purpose and meaning will grow. And part of the point of good public policy, I think, is to create an environment in which the citizens can do a better job of getting those 3 relationships right. So I thank you, and I now invite you to please rate your experience.